Let me explain what's actually happening here, because the headlines don't capture the deeper structural shifts at work. China has reportedly delivered military equipment to Iran, drones, missiles, defensive systems, allegedly transported in 16 cargo aircraft. Now, before we jump to conclusions about World War III or some grand military alliance, we need to understand the economic and geopolitical calculus driving this moment. China isn't acting out of ideology or some inherent antagonism toward Washington. This is about protecting trade routes, securing energy partnerships, and, most critically, demonstrating that the era of uncontested American influence in the Middle East is over. For decades, the United States maintained a security architecture across this region that prioritized Western access to oil, military staging grounds, and political leverage. That system is fracturing, not because of any single arms deal, but because the economic foundations of global power are shifting eastward. China's Belt and Road Initiative, its energy contracts with Tehran, its diplomatic normalization efforts between Iran and Saudi Arabia, these aren't random events. They're symptoms of a world reorganizing itself around new centers of economic gravity. And this arms transfer, if confirmed, is simply the military dimension of that reality. So let's talk about what this really means. Because when you see a headline claiming that China is arming Iran with missiles and drones, your first instinct might be to think we're on the brink of some catastrophic confrontation. But that's not quite what's happening here. And if we're going to understand the significance of this moment, we need to step back and look at the larger economic and political systems that are driving these decisions. China's relationship with Iran isn't new. These two countries have been deepening their economic ties for years, particularly since the United States ramped up its sanctions regime against Tehran. When Washington decided to withdraw from the nuclear deal in 2018 and impose what it called maximum pressure on Iran, it created a vacuum that China was more than willing to fill. And why wouldn't they? Iran has oil, natural gas, and a strategic geographic position that makes it invaluable for anyone trying to build economic infrastructure across Asia and into Europe. China has been buying Iranian oil at discounted prices, investing in Iranian infrastructure projects, and essentially becoming Tehran's most important economic partner. So when we hear about military equipment being transferred, we're not witnessing some sudden pivot or dramatic new alliance. We're seeing the natural progression of an economic partnership that's been developing for the better part of a decade. Now, let's think about this from China's perspective for a moment. Beijing is not interested in fighting a war with the United States. That would be economically disastrous for both countries, and China's leadership understands this perfectly well. What China wants is to secure its economic interests, protect its supply chains, and ensure that its Belt and Road Initiative can function without being disrupted by American military power or American-led sanctions. Iran sits right in the middle of several critical trade routes, the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passes, is controlled largely by Iran. If you're China, and you're importing massive quantities of energy to fuel your industrial economy, you want to make sure that Iran is stable, that it's friendly to your interests, and that it has the capacity to defend itself without requiring direct Chinese military intervention. So selling or transferring defensive weapons systems, drones, and missiles to Iran isn't about preparing for war with America. It's about creating a security buffer that allows China to do business without constant fear that the United States will destabilize the region in ways that harm Chinese economic interests. But here's where it gets more complicated, and this is something that doesn't get talked about enough in mainstream Western media. The United States has spent the last 75 years building a global security architecture that was designed to protect American economic dominance. After World War II, the United States emerged as the world's preeminent industrial power, and it used that position to create institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and a system of military alliances that essentially guaranteed American access to markets and resources around the world. The Middle East became a central pillar of this system because of oil. Whoever controlled Middle Eastern oil, or at least had privileged access to it, could exercise enormous leverage over the global economy. So the United States established military bases, forged alliances with monarchies and authoritarian regimes, and intervened repeatedly to ensure that no hostile power could dominate the region. For decades, this worked. American companies had access to cheap oil. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency in part because oil was traded in dollars, and Washington could use its military presence to shape political outcomes across the region. But that system is breaking down. And it's breaking down for reasons that have very little to do with military hardware and everything to do with economic fundamentals. China is now the world's largest manufacturing economy. It's the largest trading partner for more than 120 countries. It's building infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and even parts of Europe through the Belt and Road Initiative. And crucially, China doesn't need the Middle East to remain under American control. In fact, Chinese interests are often better served when the region is multipolar, when countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey can pursue independent foreign policies that allow them to do business with Beijing without having to constantly defer to Washington. So what we're seeing with this reported arms transfer is not China trying to start a war. We're seeing China trying to create the conditions for a post-American Middle East, a region where economic relationships matter more than military alliances, where countries can trade with whoever offers the best terms, and where American sanctions and American military threats carry less and less weight. Now let's think about Iran's position in all of this, because Tehran's motivations are just as important as Beijing's. Iran has been under severe economic sanctions for decades. These sanctions have crippled its economy, made it difficult to access international banking systems, and cut it off from much of the global market. But Iran has also proven remarkably resilient. It's developed domestic industries, built up its military capabilities, and found ways to circumvent sanctions through barter arrangements, cryptocurrency, and partnerships with countries that are willing to defy American pressure. China is the most important of these partners. Iranian oil goes to China, often transported in ways that avoid detection by American surveillance. Chinese goods and investment flow into Iran, and increasingly Chinese technology, including military technology, is becoming part of Iran's defense infrastructure. For Iran, this isn't just about getting weapons. It's about breaking free from the isolation that American sanctions have imposed. If Iran can modernize its military, deter American aggression, and defend itself without having to rely on nuclear weapons, then it gains leverage in any future negotiations, and it strengthens its position as a regional power. But we also have to ask ourselves why this is happening now. Why are we hearing about 16 planes supposedly carrying missiles and drones from China to Iran at this particular moment? Well, there are several factors at play. First, the geopolitical environment has shifted dramatically over the last few years. The war in Ukraine has demonstrated that the United States and its European allies are willing to use sanctions as a weapon, but it's also shown the limits of that strategy. Russia has continued to sell oil and gas largely to China and India, and its economy, while damaged, has not collapsed. This has sent a message to countries like Iran that American economic pressure can be endured and even countered if you have the right partners. Second, the normalization deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, brokered by China, has changed the regional dynamics. For years, the United States relied on the rivalry between Tehran and Riyadh to keep both countries dependent on American security guarantees. But now that they're talking, now that they're reducing tensions, the logic of American military dominance in the region starts to weaken. If Saudi Arabia doesn't need American protection from Iran, then why does it need thousands of American troops on its soil? If Iran doesn't have to worry about Saudi-funded proxies destabilizing its borders, then it can focus on economic development instead of military buildup. And third, we have to consider the broader trajectory of American foreign policy. The United States is increasingly focused on China as its primary strategic competitor. The Pentagon has said this explicitly. The Biden administration maintained Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods and added new restrictions on technology exports. There's been a concerted effort to build coalitions in Asia to contain Chinese influence. But this pivot to Asia means that the United States has less bandwidth, fewer resources, and less political will to maintain the same level of dominance in the Middle East. We've seen this play out in Afghanistan, where the United States withdrew after 20 years of occupation. We've seen it in Iraq, where American influence has waned significantly. And we're seeing it now in the Gulf, where countries that were once firmly in the American camp are now hedging their bets, doing deals with China, and pursuing more independent foreign policies. So when China arms Iran, it's not doing so in a vacuum. It's taking advantage of a strategic environment where American power is overstretched and where the old rules of the game no longer apply. Now, I want to be very clear about something because this is where the analysis often goes off the rails. This is not about good guys and bad guys. This is not about democracy versus authoritarianism or freedom versus oppression. Those narratives are useful for rallying public support, but they obscure the actual mechanisms of power that are at work here. The United States has supported plenty of authoritarian regimes when it suited American economic and strategic interests. Saudi Arabia is a perfect example. So is Egypt. So was Iraq under Saddam Hussein before he became inconvenient. And China is not supporting Iran out of some principled commitment to anti-imperialism. China is acting in its own economic interests, just as the United States acts in its own economic interests. The difference is that China's economic interests are increasingly incompatible with a world where the United States gets to unilaterally decide which countries can trade, which currencies are acceptable, and which governments are legitimate. What we're witnessing is a transition from a unipolar world, where American military and economic power was unmatched, to a multipolar world where several major powers compete for influence and where smaller countries have more room to maneuver. This transition is not going to be smooth. There will be proxy conflicts, economic disruptions, and moments of genuine danger where miscalculation could lead to catastrophic outcomes. But the fundamental driver of this transition is not military, it's economic. China has built an economy that rivals the United States in size and surpasses it in manufacturing output. Other countries, including those in the global south, are tired of a system where they have to align with Washington or face sanctions, coups, and military intervention. They're looking for alternatives, and China is offering one. It's not necessarily a better alternative in terms of human rights or democratic governance, but it's an alternative nonetheless, and that alone is enough to reshape the global order. So when we talk about China arming Iran, we need to understand it as part of this larger story. It's not an isolated incident. It's not a provocation designed to start a war. It's a signal that the old arrangements are breaking down and that new arrangements are being built in their place. The question for the United States is not whether it can prevent this from happening, because frankly, it probably can't. The question is how it responds. Does it double down on military dominance, risking confrontation, and further alienating countries that might otherwise be neutral? Or does it recognize that the world has changed, that economic partnerships and diplomatic engagement might be more effective tools than sanctions and threats? These are not easy questions, and there are powerful interests in Washington that benefit from the current system and will resist any change. But history doesn't care about what's convenient for American policymakers. History is driven by economic forces, by shifts in productive capacity, by changes in technology and trade routes, and by the decisions of billions of people around the world who are looking for better opportunities and more stable lives. The arms transfer from China to Iran, if it's happening on the scale that's being reported, is a symptom of these deeper changes. It reflects Iran's need for security in a region where American military power has been a constant threat. It reflects China's need to protect its economic investments and ensure stable access to energy. And it reflects a world where the United States can no longer simply impose its will through sanctions and military superiority. That world is uncomfortable for those of us who grew up during the era of American dominance, but it's the world we're living in now, and we need to understand it clearly if we're going to navigate it successfully. This isn't about fear-mongering or apocalyptic predictions. It's about recognizing that power is shifting, that the systems we took for granted are being challenged, and that the choices we make in response will determine whether this transition leads to greater cooperation and shared prosperity, or to conflict and instability. The evidence suggests we're at a crossroads, and what happens next depends on whether we can see past the headlines and understand the economic realities that are driving these geopolitical shifts.